Greetings again, friends, and happy spring break to all those VT peeps out there watching this. Happy Thursday to the rest of us working class, including you former students. Here's to you, but this podcast is for them. Actually, this podcast is for the world, because the awesome students in the current World Regions class have been asking me for more podcasts, even during spring break, that they want quizzes on. How awesome is this generation of students? I love them. And what we've been talking about in class, well, we spent a lot of time talking about Ukraine, but what has been coming up in class consistently that I haven't had time to get to is what in the heck is going on in Venezuela. Now, all you former students, and world followers kind of have a good sense of what's going on in Venezuela. Probably. I hope so. If you're a former student of mine, you know this guy Hugo Chavez. Current students, of course, have never heard of Hugo Chavez because he's dead. What does a dead guy have to do with a bunch of protests that started as student protests and now taken over and inflamed this place called Venezuela? Let's call this podcast Venezuelan Violence. Is this a socialism showdown? Question mark. Boom, boom. There you go. So the reason I bring these two things up, this current violence across Venezuela, and also maybe has something to do with Hugo Chavez, is because everything's related. You know this, people. And it is a couple different anniversaries that have kind of come together here in early March in Venezuela that have been feeding off each other. One of them is that it's the first 1 year anniversary of the death of Hugo Chavez, the former president, who died of cancer a year ago, just over a year ago. And it's also, I believe, about a month anniversary, maybe a little longer now, of the start of this protest, which has engulfed Venezuela in violence across the country. In Caracas, mostly the capital, but it didn't even start there. It started in San Cristobal. So a month of violence, a year since Hugo passed. Unrelated? Nothing's ever unrelated. You know that. We'll start with Hugo. We'll try to do this quickly. I won't do a huge bio on the guy because he's dead. And here he is dead for a year and yet somehow still having impact, huge impact on Venezuelan society, and it could be argued Latin American society as a whole, because who was Hugo? He was the self-proclaimed firebrand, great orator, could fire up the masses, self-proclaimed greatest socialist of the 21st century. This is a guy from common roots, by the way, from the common class who rose up the ranks of the military and then ended up being president of the country. Cinderella story, baby. Everybody loves a Cinderella story. And when he got in power, he was basically, like many other left-leaning folks across Latin America, looked at the system and said, hey, look, our country's been sold out. We got way too many poor people here. In fact, most people are dirt poor. All the wealth is concentrated in the hands of few. This is because of market capitalism and the heavy hand of the United States, which manipulates and forces all of us to be market capitalists, which we all have to sell our souls in order to sell more crap to people. So I, Hugo Chavez, declare a Bolivarian revolution after the famous revolutionary Simon Bolivar. And I am a Bolivarian guy who's going to have a Bolivarian revolution across all Latin America to move away from market capitalism, uncontrolled, rampant capitalism, and move it some towards what self-proclaimed in his words, a socialist state. That is a state that does a lot more to redistribute wealth, to give out more benefits, to make it a more equal society. Not quite communism, but the same kind of utopian idea. That we want to structure our society to do more for the people and not just be an avenue for people to get rich as hell, and a few people get rich as hell and all the rest of us have to suffer. Okay? And this was Hugo's life's work. He became president, I believe, in 1998. He was in charge of the country for over a decade. Was it a decade and a half? For a brief period, there was a military coup that took him from power, and he got back in, which made him even more of a Cinderella story. By the way, he was an avid despiser of the United States. He despised capitalism. He despised the United States. He saw the evil hand of the United States in everything that was ever wrong on planet Earth. So he was a bit of an extremist, but, here's the big but. Because he controlled this society, or was the leader of this society, he was democratically elected, by the way. All of the elections for Hugo Chavez, whether you hate his guts or love him, all of them were declared free and fair. So a majority of people in Venezuela also loved Hugo Chavez. And by the way, here's why. Because as I'm trying to suggest, Venezuela has been a fairly unequal society for much of its modern history, if not all of its history. Very small class of the owners, the aristocracy, the elite, which control most of the wealth and have most of the wealth. And then you have the huge amount of poor masses. This is a story very common across lots of parts of Latin America. And so when Hugo Chavez came to power, he said, well, this is because of market capitalism and because of this unequal society, I'm going to rally the poor masses and have them vote for me. And that's exactly what he did. Well, how do you get poor people to vote for you? Tell them you're going to give them stuff. Tell them you're going to change this unfair system of which they've been a captive of to make it more equitable and fair and better for them. Redistribute wealth from the top tier and give it to the bottom tiers. And it's no surprise he gets elected time and time again. Because if a majority of your people are poor, in a democracy, the majority get to elect who's the president. Majority poor, they elect this president who says he's going to give them stuff. That's how he came to power, and then he set about actually doing what he said he was going to do, which is remodeling the society into some sort of socialist society. This, of course, infuriates business people. It infuriates rich people. It infuriates the elite. And it actually, in this case in Venezuela, made the middle class not that happy either, because very small elite upper class, a small, decent to smaller sized middle class. But the upper classes in any society that's going to get restructured, they're going to lose. They're the ones that are going to get their wealth redistributed. So the middle, upper, and upper classes despise the guy from the get-go, but they're the minority. So there was already friction with this within the society the whole time he's in charge. Okay, what else is Hugo famous for? Well, he's famous for, I'm going to I'm going to have the state of Venezuela take over more control of the economy. Again, in kind of a communist utopia type situation, that the state is going to run the oil industry. We're going to kick out the multinational corporations, and we're going to take control of the oil industry so that we make all the profits from the oil industry so we can give away wealth and stuff to the people from the oil industry. That's what Saudi Arabia did too, by the way. All the OPEC members, of course, control their state oil industry, so Venezuela is no exception there. But Hugo wanted to take this several steps further, so he was all about heavy regulation of the economy. Maybe taking over agricultural facilities to be able to redistribute food to people. Or price controlling. That's a big famous socialist thing you do, is like you tell people, oh, you can't charge $20,000 for that car because it only cost you $8,000 to make it, so you can only sell it for $10,000 because that's more fair. So business people, rich people, nobody likes socialism, and definitely not communism. And so in this case, there was already friction in the society as Hugo's trying to reinvent it into this socialist utopia. Got it? Okay. That's Hugo Chavez. He died a year ago. What's he got to do with this? Well, this is that in the last month, all hell's broken loose, and protests have started small and have grown big. Now, there were plenty of protests, by the way, the whole time Hugo Chavez was alive. And then there were protests when he died. And there's been scattered opposition to these policies and scattered opposition to Hugo and the fan base around Hugo for his whole time in the president's office. But it's always been disorganized, and again, the minority. Sorry to all my friends who don't like Hugo Chavez, but you're in the minority in Venezuela. That's why he kept getting in power. So what's happened recently to start up protest again a year after this guy dies? Well, it started by college students in a town called San Cristobal. San Cristobal is over in the western side, deep western side of Venezuela, right beside Colombia. Geography is always important. Always consider your geography. Why would the fact that San Cristobal's way in the west next to Colombia have anything to do with this? Well, because it's further away from the capital. San Cristobal and that state, that sub-state of Venezuela, don't have a whole lot of Hugo Chavez and socialism fans. In fact, there's significant political opposition in and around San Cristobal. And they're right next door to Colombia, and Hugo Chavez always hated each other. The government of Venezuela and the government of Colombia despise each other. In fact, you should probably jot that down if we're going to do a quiz. These two countries have not liked each other, accused each other of all sorts of heinous crimes and allowing narco-terrorism to occur. And here's the kicker, though. Colombia has, for the last decade plus, been run by center-right conservative politicians. And are you starting to see it now? And Hugo Chavez and the guy who took over for him, Nicolas Maduro, are both hardcore leftist guys. So it's two different political and economic ideologies altogether from Venezuela to Colombia. And that's why the states don't like each other. So already we're setting the geographic stage as, oh, it's San Cristobal over there in the far west next to Colombia, where there's a bunch of people who don't like the central government, don't like socialism already. Okay, that's why, by the way, it started in San Cristobal. See, it's got to pay attention to the geography. Okay, so what happened? College students started protesting after the sexual assault of, I believe, definitely one or maybe two different students that the local police just couldn't do anything about. And everybody's like, well, we don't get the resources, or we couldn't find who did it, whatever. And so these college students, and I believe it was even like an official worldwide student day or day of recognition of students or something. So on this student day, this kind of national holiday, the students went out and protest about not just these isolated incidents, because they weren't isolated incidents. Crime in Venezuela is horrific. I mean, the horrific, like over the top. And so these college students were super pissed that some of their own, fellow students had been attacked, and everybody's like, oh, well, whatever. I mean, crime's everywhere. Venezuela has one of the highest murder rates on planet Earth. I believe it's the first or second highest murder rate in the Western Hemisphere. So crime is crazy there. And so these students were saying, this is out of control. We're protesting until the government does something about this heinous crime. And they're not alone, by the way. When this protest went into its second or third or fourth day, the National Guard came in to break it up. People get pushed, people get shoved, people throw rocks, people shoot guns, and people got hurt. I don't even know if people died early on the college campus, because it's always bad when college students die. It just looks bad when unarmed college kids get killed. So I'm not even sure the facts of anybody died in the opening of this protest. But because the government sent in troops to basically, and National Guard, not even like Army, but sent in troops to disperse it, looked really bad too. And people across Venezuela, you got several different groups of people across Venezuela who join these protests. One, people who hate socialism and have hated Hugo Chavez and hate Nicolas Maduro, his successor. They hate this whole group, and so they're miffed, and they'll go to protest for the simple fact they don't like what's going on in Venezuela. Two, you got all kinds of average people who may or may not care about Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro, but who are absolutely fed up with crime and the decaying state of Venezuela. And then three, you got protesters who are just rebel rousers, or college students who are joining in for personal reasons or whatever. So you have this blossoming of this, and people see that, oh, college kids got beat up by National Guard, and they were protesting about crime. That looks bad. So that's how this has escalated. Now, a month later, as I've suggested, about a month, and you had a lot of, again, these groups that I'm talking about, a lot of pent-up rage waiting to pop. That's how these revolutions start. More and more unhappy people, unhappy about whatever, that suddenly find an outlet and just the powder keg gets lit. A month later now, we got, I think, a couple dozen, at least 20 or 25 people dead. On both sides. Let me stress this, on both sides. Police have been shot. National Guard people have been shot and killed. Molotov cocktails are being thrown. And the police are using, and the National Guard are using force. So you got a couple dozen people dead, maybe 1,000 people detained, arrested, including one of the protest leaders, one of the political opposition leaders, who has now been incited for causing panic or dissent. And this starts to look bad. Now you're arresting political people for what? For dissent. Okay. And the people who are still protesting, again, in cities all across Venezuela, and this is what you're seeing on the news, are setting up barricades and burning cars and burning tires and stopping traffic, and then the police have to come in and try to break it up, and it is a mess. It's just a huge mess. And now you got poor people caught in the middle. So you got people that hate the government who are protesting, people who are legit protesters, protesting about crime and other things. who were stopping traffic and stopping people from going shopping and burning tires in your front yard. And so and the military's coming in from one direction, and the common people are just like, what the hell? I mean, this is just a disaster for really all parties involved. I know I should just beat up the Maduro government more, but I try to empathize, and it's like, this is a mess for everybody. It's just a big mess. And there's violence on both sides, so you can't just say the government's crushing everybody. I mean, it's mostly the government crushing everybody, I think, but government people have died. So how did we get into such a mess? What has divided this society so badly that a protest escalates into widespread nationwide protest? Well, I've already alluded to some of this. Venezuelan history, maybe for all of it, certainly in the modern era, it's been a very class-based society. And it's hard to go up the chain. And so a lot of people, the poor class, the bottom class has been the biggest, and the rich class, and they're the whiter class, they're the smallest up top. And it's been a divided society for some time just based on that, before any Hugo Chavez type character comes up. So class warfare has perhaps always been latent in Venezuela. The problem now, since the Chavez, Maduro, and followers of Chavez are called Chavistas now. And this is the Bolivarian revolution. It was what he was espousing, and that is a socialist revolution to bring equality to our great state into some sort of semi-communist utopia, I guess. The problem with this style of socialism, and it's a fairly extreme manifestation to be sure, is that it's actually not done that well for many in the country, and not done that well for Venezuela as a whole. Now, hold on. There are going to be those fans, left-leaning folks. I'm not a hater of socialism, by the way, if it can be applied correctly and work. There will be many Venezuelans who maybe see this podcast who say, you know what, I support Chavez. He's an okay guy. Or he was. He's dead now. I support Maduro. I support a more equal society. You know what? So do I. And I want all of you Americans to understand, the American government, by the way, despises Maduro. It despises Hugo Chavez. So the U.S. and Venezuela despise each other. The U.S. does not like any brand of socialism anywhere close to this. Okay? So you don't know anything about this. But I do want you to know that the supporters of Chavez and crew would say, hey, look, our society has gotten more equal. It was a very class-based society, and most of the class was poor. And wealth disparity has actually decreased in Venezuela. It used to be like one of the worst wealth disparities in South America. Now it's one of the best. They would argue that lots of poor people are now not as poor. They would argue that things are more affordable, and why is that wrong for consumers? So I don't know the numbers, but the argument could be made that, I don't know, 500,000, 5 million people have been pulled out of poverty. Mostly by perhaps redistributing stuff and trying to restructure the economy to make it more conducive for poor people to get in the game. So this is why I'm telling you this, because I do want you to understand you're going to be painted a terrible picture of Venezuela by American news sources, because they just follow the American government shtick, which is communism is bad because we hate commies, all right? The U.S. hates commies. And this brand of socialism is kind of close to commies. So we had a whole Cold War to fight commies, and we beat the commies, and there's no more commies because we hate commies. And these guys are still trying to do something kind of close to that commie stuff, so we can't stand them. Plus, they took away perhaps some business assets from American businesses that they kicked out during their socialist revolution, namely Exxon and some other oil companies. So there's no love lost here to the U.S. government. But, sorry for that big, to get to the but, there's still this, the Chavista movement, the Bolivarian revolution, Hugo Chavez himself, and now Nicolas Maduro, please believe me, are widely supported by the majority of people in Venezuela. I'm not saying I'm happy about it. I'm not saying this is because they're good people or they have good policies. In fact, I'll tell you the counter here in just a minute. But I want you to understand that at least 50% of the Venezuelan population still supports them in this idea. That's why they keep winning elections. those are the people, and they have gone out to the streets for pro-government protest, to counter the anti-government protest. And why do they love him so much? Because he has made things more equal for them, perhaps. So what about the other folks? What has this experiment, socialist experiment in Venezuela, why has it not proven successful for everybody? Well, besides the poorer classes that have got pulled up a little bit, unfortunately it seems, and this is an early call on this because this whole experiment's only about 10 or 15 years old in Venezuela, it seems that a lot of people from the bottom got pulled up by pulling everybody from the top down, which of course, again, that's what pisses off the upper classes. And so all the middle class, anybody that used to be middle class and up, their lives have gotten way worse. They've just gotten way worse. And now it's starting to get way worse for the whole society. Because dig this. This is a country of only about 30 million people. I know 30 million is a lot, but that's like how many people live in New York City. So it's not a huge population. And I don't know that I've even mentioned this yet. Perhaps I only did in passing. Venezuela is rich as hell in oil. It's one of the biggest oil exporters on planet Earth. Now, I don't know if you know much about economic stuff, but if you're one of the biggest oil exporters on planet Earth on a daily basis, you're making bank. Bank! Venezuela makes bank. It's one of the reasons why they took over the oil industry, actually, so they can make more bank, so they can give more stuff to their citizens. Again, that's not a bad idea in and of itself. But here's the bad thing. It's been really bad for the society as a whole because here they are, a nation of only 30 million people, a huge oil exporter, money been pouring in for 20 years on the oil, and they can't keep the lights on in Caracas, the capital. There's a red flag right there. There are rolling blackouts in most of the major cities of Venezuela because they don't have enough electricity production and they don't have the infrastructure to keep it going. And you're like, okay, all right, but hang on, it even gets worse than that. As I know I've suggested, Venezuela has one of the highest murder rates on planet Earth, outside of active war zones. And you're like, what? How can this government be taking all this wealth to redistribute it to make lives better for everybody? And crime is out of control. So something's been lost there as well. On top of that now, you have somewhere between 50 and 60% inflation on virtually all foodstuffs and common consumer goods. I guess on everything. Now, I'm not going to get into a big economic debate here about what the hell inflation is. But it pretty much means something that you paid $1 for last year now costs $1.60. If you have 60% inflation, that means the prices are rising by 60% from one year to the next. For no reason. So let's say a loaf of bread cost $1. Well, it cost $1 last year. With 60% inflation, it costs $1.60 now. You say, well, who cares? That's just $1. It's 60 more cents. That's one loaf of bread. If you bought a $100 stereo last year, it's $160 this year. If you bought a $10,000 car last year, it's $16,000 car this year. And again, it's not because the car cost any more to make or the bread cost any more to make. Hell, the price of bread's been the same for 10,000 years. Something must be going on to cause inflationary pressures like this. And what it is, most likely, is economic mismanagement. You got the government who's meddling too much in the economy, who goes in and they didn't just nationalize the oil industry, and they haven't just artificially kept the price of gas low. People in Venezuela pay like pennies on the dollar for gas. And that's a government program because they want it to be fair. And they want poor people to be able to afford gas. And that sounds nice, but then you run out of gas. And then they say, well, okay, well, then the price of bread's getting too high. We're going to go control the price of bread. We're going to go in, and this is true. I couldn't even make this crap up. They thought the price, the current president, Nicolas Maduro, I think just 6 months ago, thought that the prices of consumer electronics and TVs was too high. They thought that Radio Shack was overcharging people. So the government went in and said, nope, we're going to price fix everything in the store. All TVs in Venezuela are now half off because that's the price it should be. It's not outright nationalization, although they've been doing it. Chavez and Maduro have been the kings of nationalization, and you know what that means when the government goes and takes over an industry. They've nationalized cement. They already nationalized oil. They've nationalized parts of the agriculture. They nationalized the milk production so they can control it, so they can keep the prices artificially low. or what they would say, or more fair and low. That's all well and dandy and good. And you make it cheap for people, for poor people especially. But here's the deal. Do you know business people, any business people, that want to make just a penny profit when they could be making $100 profit? And by the way, the government of Venezuela says, yes, that's part of the problem. The reason why inflation is so high is because all these dirty, greedy business people are not making enough stuff because they're intentionally wanting to tank our economy. And you're like, really? Okay. I don't know that many greedy people who intentionally lose all of their own business and their own money just for spite. I mean, maybe they exist in Venezuela. But you see where I'm going with this. The Chavez-Maduro revolution, socialist revolution, has helped lots of poor people. It has been disastrous for the society as a whole at this point now. And again, they're not going to admit that, and they would tell me I'm wrong and all the reasons I'm wrong. But it doesn't matter. People can now not go into the grocery store and get the bread, and they can't get toilet paper, and you can't buy a car because it's too expensive, and the lights are going off, and the murder rate's high. And it's like, you can talk all you want to me, but something ain't right in your society. The redistribution to control prices and do all this stuff has worked a little bit. But ideology aside, let's forget about capitalism and versus socialism and all the other isms. It's probably the outright mismanagement of the entire economy that's led to all these negative trends. And how has the government dealt with this? Are they trying to fix this? And again, they got tons of oil money pouring in. Tons of oil money pouring in. But things are kind of getting worse. And so, what has the government been doing to fix all this? Well, they took over the media. And Venezuela is a democracy, and they go vote. That's true. But the government, and Hugo Chavez did this, not even the current president, Nicolas Maduro. Hugo Chavez went in and kind of took over the media little by little, and now the media, for the most part, in Venezuela is a mouthpiece of the government. I don't hate Chavez or Maduro. I want to make that clear. I'm not making fun of them. This is what's going on. This is not a great mystery. The last few remaining TV channels and newspapers that were critical of the government got taken over by the government or shut down by the government. So you take over the media so that you can paint the picture of what you want your citizens to think about your society. So instead of fixing things, they took over the media so they can fix the story. They've made sure that the military and the police are kind of staunchly on their team by stacking the deck with their cohorts and colleagues and people that think like them and like the Bolivarian Revolution. And Chavez did that for over a decade. It's still questionable if the military is 100% behind them, but they do appear to be backing the government for now. And then finally, what has the Venezuelan government done for over a decade to solve some of these problems? They've blamed all of these problems on everybody else. Everybody else is to blame. The United States, usually first and foremost, catches the blame for everything. Whatever's wrong in Venezuela, the United States did it or is doing it. There are these claims that $50 million or $50 billion from the United States float in every year just to try to destroy Venezuela, to fund the opposition, to overthrow the Chavez government or the Maduro government. Do I think the U.S. plays a role? Yes. All countries and all governments try to get things done their way on planet Earth. And the United States has got a very big purse in order to get things done their way. But trying to say that the U.S. does everything in your sovereign state country is quite frankly just a huge cop-out. That you're like saying, well, we have no power. The U.S. does everything here, even though we hate them and there's no U.S. businesses here. It's like, well, I don't know how much the U.S. can possibly influence you then, but okay. So the government of Venezuela for over a decade has been like, it's all the U.S.'s fault. Or it's our neighbor's fault, like Colombia, who we hate, because Colombia is a center-right conservative country, and they're friends with the United States, so obviously they're in cahoots, so it's Colombia's fault too. Anything that we can't blame on the U.S. must be Colombia. And then now, and this was also happening during the Chavez regime, now anybody who protests, enemy of the state. It's all the protesters' fault. And because because greedy business people are just want to hoard all the wealth. It's also their fault. So it's business people's fault. It's foreign government's fault. It's outsiders' fault. It's protesters' fault. Anybody who protests now, they're just trying to cause trouble and dethrone our great socialist experiment. I'm not making fun of socialism. I'm not making fun of Hugo Chavez because he's dead. I'm not even making fun of Nicolas Maduro. But when things keep stacking up, like you can't keep the lights on and you have a high murder rate and your economy is floundering and it's 60% inflation, you got to at some point stop pointing fingers at everybody else. This regime, this government, this group of people has been in charge of Venezuela for a decade and a half. They can't keep just saying it's everybody else's fault. We're doing everything exactly right, and it's all these other outsiders or business people or greedy people or protesters that are doing everything wrong. And it starts to, when you start taking over the media and you start breaking up protest and you start jailing opposition leaders, then it starts to look like you're a dictatorship, even though this government has been truly democratically elected every time they've ran. Are you starting to see the rub now? That's what's happening in Venezuela. And that's why these students started to protest about a very local issue to them, crime against fellow students. That is a national issue because crime's terrible, and everybody started to take the streets, including the people who see their whole society, in their eyes, getting flushed down the toilet. And a government who's saying, it's not us, we are doing everything exactly right, it's everybody else's fault. That can only play so long. I mean, if you truly believe that socialism is the way to go and you have these great socialist policies, that's great. I say believe it. Go for it. And people have gotten better. I've been telling you this whole time, trying to defend this group that, yes, lots of people who were poor 10 years ago ain't as poor now. But the society as a whole is not doing well, and you can't just keep saying, we have got great policies. It's not the policies. Obviously, yes, it is the policies. Something's going on here because you got more people who are unhappy now as well. You got some people who are poor that ain't as poor, but you also got a bunch of people who are happy who ain't that happy anymore. So something is going on, and that's why this society is in a vice, because these people ain't going away. It really, the die is cast at this point. You're either for socialism or you're against it. And there's really, it doesn't matter that Chavez died and Maduro took over. It won't matter if Maduro dies and someone else takes over. This is kind of an ideological battle now for the state of Venezuela, and everybody's already sided up. Right now, it still appears that the pro-socialist forces still have the majority. It appears. I'm not a political analyzer of that type of thing. But it appears that most people still support the socialist idea, and it's going to go forward. But they're going to start losing support if you can't get the murder rate down in your country. The government's going to lose even their supporters if things continue on their current track. So they got to stop pointing the finger at everybody else and going and beating up protesters. It's a legitimate voice. Dude, we're tired of this. And that's what you got going on in Venezuela right now. Protest starts in San Cristobal, takes over the whole country because it's a powder keg, an ideologically divided country that's been a powder keg, quite frankly, since Chavez took over, again, I want to say 1998. And the thing is, in today's world, Chavez was a really great speaker. He's a really passionate guy. And again, he is the Cinderella story, from rags to riches. So he had a good narrative. And because he's a good speaker and passionate, and he raged against the United States, which kind of made people across Latin America and haters of the United States, like Iran or North Korea, they loved him. He formed relationships with other very leftist people to try to build a different society. I got no beef with that. Experiment. Try to build a different society. But the current president, Nicolas Maduro, ain't no Chavez. And so he was a former bus driver who worked his way up the ranks of the Chavez government. And he's an okay guy, I guess, but he's not a passionate speaker. And it's questionable that he can hold all this together. When in my assessment, in the Boyer assessment, it's the economic policies that are simply flawed. I don't think the people are flawed. I just think that what they're trying to do doesn't seem like it's working. You can't keep the lights on, something's not working. So, main points here to sum up. I know, it's like 35 minutes, sorry. You guys asked for this podcast. I just said screw it, just make it a long one. The main points here from the government standpoint, Maduro still has widespread support of the peoples, of the Chavistas, of the movement, who are huge Hugo fans, even though he's been dead a year. Now, whether it's 50% or 60%, I don't know, but I'd say it's about half. This government simply has to man up and take responsibility for some of these failed policies and start to do something about it, whether it's shifting away from the socialist dream, which some are accusing him of already, simply by saying he wanted to talk with business people and student leaders. A lot of people who are harder core left than Maduro said, oh, you're a sellout. So the Chavez dream is over. The socialist utopia is over. So, I mean, it's not, cut and dry even within his political movement. But they're going to have to do something. They're going to have to suck it up and do something. Especially since they should be rich because they sell tons of oil every year. Other points from the government. Maduro blames everything on the United States, which Hugo Chavez did too. And they've expelled U.S. ambassadors and say the U.S. is the one that funded all these students to go out and protest. And it's like, I guess. I'm no investigative reporter, but if it's $50 million are floating around there from the U.S. government, it shouldn't be that hard to find. And people should be like, oh, look at this check I got from Uncle Sam. I mean, I'm not buying that one so much either. Other government points, just for good measure, anything they can't blame on the United States, they'll blame on Colombia. Because, again, Colombia's center-right conservative. And there's friction because they're ideologically opposed. And the Colombians have signed a free trade agreement with the United States because the U.S. and Colombia are buddies. Maduro also now hates Panama and cut off diplomatic ties with Panama because Panama, also currently run by a center-right conservative person, had the audacity to go to the Organization of American States and ask to have some sort of Organization of American States investigation to check out what's going on in Venezuela just to make sure everything's on the up and up and see if they can help. And the Maduro government then ostracized the Panamanians and said, nope, we hate them now too, because if it's not the U.S.'s fault, it's Colombia's fault, and if it's not Colombia's fault, it must be Panama's fault now. Again, they're very prone on blaming everybody else. Yeah, okay, and if they got anybody else to blame, it's business people. And so they're going to perhaps try to control more and more of the business in order to be able to get more toilet paper on the shelves and get more cheap milk to people and whatever they got to do. That seems like a disastrous policy, but it may be the way they go in order to keep up their socialist ideals. In terms of main points for the opposition in this whole Venezuelan violent situation, I do want you to know this. It's not a single voice. The people who are out burning tires and raging and throwing Molotov cocktails, and some are doing it peacefully, but it's been pretty violent, the pictures anyway. Some people just want a better life. Some people are sick of crime. Some people are sick of socialism. Some people never liked it to begin with. Some people want Nicolas Maduro's head on a platter. And those are the loudest people. Usually the people who want the most extreme violence are the ones who are the loudest leading the parade. So, and those are the ones that the government rightfully points to and says, no, we're not going to allow you to overthrow the government, so we're going to go stop that. I mean, even I kind of legitimately agree with that. It's like, you can't have people out there calling for blood and then get pissed off when the police come and arrest them or bloody them while they're trying to bloody somebody else. So the opposition is not a single voice. This isn't like a big Arab Spring, and the Arab Spring actually was closer to a single voice where everybody's like, we're sick of everything. And we're all in this together, and we're all sick of the same things. You do not have that in Venezuela. Lots of different people pissed for lots of different reasons. The opposition is also very chaotic. It's not organized. There is no single leader. There's not even a few leaders. There's no clear vision for leadership. There's no platform of what people are wanting. If they overthrew the Maduro government tomorrow, there's nobody to step up to do anything. So that makes it problematic from the opposition side. And quite frankly, if you've made it to the end of the podcast, this is some of the most important stuff. So I'm glad you stayed with me for 40 minutes. The protesters have probably actually hurt themselves more than the government. So a lot of protesters go out and raise all sorts of hell and then get shot, and then they're like, the government looks really bad, so everybody hates the government now. It's very likely that this has not hurt the Venezuelan government at all. It may strengthen them because, as I've suggested, lots of regular citizens are now completely pissed off at what's going on because they can't even get to the grocery store or their job because of the barricades and the violence and the craziness. So more and more regular people are disenfranchised with the protesters. And the Chavistas and the supporters of the government, they're more solidified than ever before. So it could be that if the Maduro government clamps down even further, that they might have even more people say, thank you. Yeah, can we please get back to normalcy here? It's amazing how much repression that people put up with just for normalcy. So you may see the government hand strengthen because of all this. And these protests have likely hurt themselves more because leading up to this for the last several years, there's actually been an organized and growing and more successful opposition political group that's been doing better and better in elections, in national elections and kind of local and state elections. They finally started to get their act together just in the last few years and kind of unify under a single umbrella and say, hey, look, if we want to change our country, we're going to have to unify our 10 political anti-Chavez parties into one and offer something new and good. And they were starting to make headway, even though all the chips are stacked against them. And this is why it's a little dicey to call Venezuela a true democracy. Yes, they vote, but opposition parties are not given a fair shake. Sorry for all you Venezuelan Chavista fans out there, but the opposition is not given a fair shake. Quite frankly, it would be the equivalent of saying, well, the U.S. is a democracy, and the Republicans control everything, and the Republicans control all the media, and the Republicans can advertise all they want, and the Democrats, no, they don't really get invited to debates. No, they don't really get anything printed in the newspaper. No, they can't put up political ads. But then it's a free and fair vote, and it's like, well, is that really? I mean, is that really free and fair? So even though the opposition has had all these chips stacked against them, they were actually gaining ground. So this protest stuff has probably hurt them worse than anybody because now you got more citizens who are probably turned against the protesters / opposition because it's turned so violent. So that's the deal. It's likely that the government's hand in the long term or the short term has probably been strengthened, but for how much longer can they keep up these policies, which it's hard to see how they're working. It's hard to see how this is a success for the society as a whole. All of this friction within Venezuela is really a showdown over socialism. Is the state going to go down this path, keep going down this path, or are there going to be enough of this opposition to try and change their very state by democratic means? It ain't likely to change anytime soon. As I've suggested, the die has been cast. You're on one side or the other at this point. There's not much changing your mind. But due to the disorganization and the opposition in combination with the increasingly repressive state apparatus itself, these tensions will likely continue to fester into the future. The protest right this second will likely die down, but the society itself hasn't changed. It's not likely to change. And so an explosion will happen again. And next time, it may be way bigger, it may be way worse, and it could be full-on revolution / civil war. But that remains to be seen. That's the report I've got about what's going on in Venezuela right now. And I hope you understand a bit more of the complexities of the issue and about socialism and about a divided ideological state and the Maduro government and lots of other things. But for now, party on.